Hello. Whoa, that's a little loud. Uh, Welcome, everybody. My name is Bruce Patton. I'm curator here at Savoy. Thank you for coming to our stunning Studebaker presentation. We brought in Andy Beckman from the National Studebaker Museum. And have a couple things I want to do first, and then I'll bring on Andy. But here in May is our Cars Connect Us Together. So we're doing our annual appeal. So if you would, think about that when you're out here in the museum. Also like to talk about the exhibits that are currently going on. So obviously the Stunning Studebakers, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. We just put in the barn find, so hopefully you guys got to see those out there. The fabulous fiberglass, our locally owned, which will be going out soon, and then the Savoy collection. The next one's coming up when the locally owned go out. We have the Harvest to Highway. If you guys wonder what that is, it is manufacturers that built both tractors and vehicles. And so those will be going in here in June. And we have some really exciting tractors and cars and or truck to go with that. So hopefully you guys got to see The Lionheart, which was the last movie that was here. If not, next one is Grand Theft Auto. So you can see that. That's coming up here in June 13th, Friday the 13th. So should be a lucky movie. I'd like to thank Styles Auto Care. Again, we appreciate their support so that we can do these Tireside chats. So appreciate their support. And also like to thank Tom and Ann Early. They actually helped sponsor this exhibit, the Stunning Studebaker exhibit. So I'd like to thank them also for their help in supporting us. Now then, I'd like to bring on Andy Beckman. He's an archivist there at the Studebaker National Museum. Andy, he's been with them since 1999 and currently serves as an archivist. He previously worked at the Sheboygan, I got it, Wisconsin, Society. And he holds a BA in history from the University of Wisconsin. And I heard he's a Green Bay fan, so, you know, that's okay, right? Okay. All right. So anyway, he completed his Modern Archives Institute at National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, D.C. in 2009. He earned his mid-level certificate in collections preservations at the Campbell Center for Historic Preservations Studies in Mount Carroll, Illinois. And he also is the author of the Studebaker National Museum Over a Century on Wheels and Studebaker's Last Dance, the Avanti, and is a columnist for the Studebaker Drivers Club magazine. And one other thing is that he grew up in a family of Studebaker owners and currently owns a 1941 Studebaker President Skyway cruising sedan and a 1964 Studebaker Daytona hardtop. They were just talking about those just a minute ago. So I'd like to go ahead and give the microphone over to Andy and the remote.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's see. Am I coming through okay out there? Awesome. Awesome. Well, great. We'll get started here. And if you saw a 64 Studebaker Daytona hardtop in the parking lot earlier today, that's not my car. A very nice car owned by Ken Jones right here. Appreciate him bringing that out today. Let's see here. All right. We're going to start. Over a Century on Wheels. And many people are somewhat aware of Studebaker's existence prior to the automotive age, but not many people are aware how far back and what their history was in the horse-drawn era. The Studebaker Company got its start when two brothers, Henry and Clement Studebaker, opened a blacksmith shop in downtown South Bend, February 16th, 1852. We see this early advertising card from their company. You see H&C Studebakers, manufacturers and dealers in carriages, buggies, wagons, at Michigan Street, South Bend, Indiana. Now, the Studebakers had arrived in South Bend from Ohio, and actually the family had come to this country in 1760 from Germany. They were sword makers in the old country, which translated into blacksmithing in this country. And the fun part about Studebaker history is they use the names John, Clement, and Peter over and over and over again from generation to generation. So it always makes genealogy, you really got to pay attention to your John, Clements, and Peters if you're doing Studebaker family history. But as far as Henry and Clem, their father, John Clement Studebaker, was a very accomplished blacksmith. He taught that trade to his 5 sons, and eventually all of whom would be involved in the company. See, downtown South Bend, late 1850s, early 1860s, very typical of many kind of in the western United States towns at the time. The railroad had just come to South Bend, I believe it was 1849. Actually, Clem and Henry's sister Sally had moved to South Bend just a year or two prior. They communicated back to the family that it seemed like a nice, prosperous town, so named for it's on the south bend of the St. Joseph River that runs through northern Indiana. And so Henry and Clem made their way to northern Indiana to see if they could make their fortune. And indeed, the Studebaker brothers' shop for its first few years was typical of a small-town blacksmith shop. They made a few wagons. In fact, their very first day in business, their sole receipts were they shod 1 horse, put 25 cents in the till that day, but things picked up a little more. They actually made 3 wagons their first year in business, one of which was for their younger brother, John M. Studebaker. Now, John M. didn't really want to stay in South Bend. He wanted to go out west. California, the gold rush was luring him away from northern Indiana, and he thought his fame and fortune laid outside South Bend in particular and west of the Mississippi. He took a wagon train out to Placerville, California, and he found out something real fast. He wasn't the only man who had this idea. Many other people thought their fortune laid in the gold rush. But he ran into an acquaintance from South Bend out there who owned a blacksmith shop, and he said, look, there's far more miners than there's gold to be found, but every miner needs a wheelbarrow. Do you want to come work for me making wheelbarrows? He's like, okay. And actually, he made far more money selling wheelbarrows to prospectors than he ever did finding gold. And by the time 1858 rolled around, J.M. Studebaker was a wealthy man. He had gotten word from his brothers, however, that the shop was having some problems. The panic of 1857 had left the company long on credit and short on cash, and they wired J.M. and see if he could help out. J.M. returned to South Bend. He actually took a ship, went around the Cape, around South America, went up to docked in New York, and made his way back across Indiana with $8,000 in gold nuggets sewn into his belt. When he got back to South Bend, he took half of that, bought out his elder brother's Henry's share of the firm, and invested the other half into the company as working capital. And now the company had a new name, as they had to knew it was now C and J.M. Studebaker was what they went by. Eventually, younger brothers Peter and Jacob Studebaker joined the firm. Peter was a merchant in Goshen, Indiana. Naturally, he was, this man in the general store said that he was probably the first Studebaker dealer because he no doubt would be happy to sell his brother's wagons through his shop. Peter was a natural-born salesman. And the thing about the Studebaker brothers in the early horse-drawn days, their skills meshed very well. Peter was a salesman. J.M. and Clem were very good administrators. They had learned lessons the hard way from their father, John C., who was a very good blacksmith but a very poor businessman. He was quick to extend credit in exchange for work. However, his own creditors were not near as generous, and the family was usually one step ahead of the sheriff as they moved from town to town, trying not to get foreclosed upon. Jacob Studebaker, as the youngest, he went and took some business courses from a small college on the north side of South Bend. What's that college again? Do you remember, Bruce? We were talking about that. That's right, Notre Dame. They play football on Saturdays, from what I understand. If you look on the alumni rolls, you can go down and search, and there's J.F. Studebaker, 1865, 1866. He eventually joined the firm and was placed in charge of the fine carriage division. Well, the Studebakers had grown from a small blacksmith shop. J.M.'s money had helped the firm expand. Peter was going around the country setting up outlets all over the United States, and they had built, by the standards of the day, a massive new factory, coincidentally, right on the rail line in South Bend. So they were pretty well set up until the fire hit in 1872. The brothers experienced a devastating factory fire, which probably could have ruined many companies, but no, they took stock of the situation. They sent Peter off to Chicago to try and replace the raw stock that they had lost, and contacted their customers and said, hey, no, we're going to rebuild bigger and better than ever. And that's exactly what they did. Unfortunately, another fire hit in 1874. But having gone through this once already, they kind of knew what they had to do, and they recovered. If you can imagine, 2 devastating fires, 2 years apart, probably enough to do in most firms, but the Studebakers were resilient, and they managed to pull through. As far as their product line, they produced everything, just anything you could put behind a horse. You see a garbage collection wagon here. You can just see the Studebaker label there. And you know that wagon was brand new. That was probably the first load of trash it had ever dumped because when's the last time you saw a shiny garbage truck? Street sprinklers. What else do we have here? A fine coach. The Studebaker brothers were offering a wide variety of, as I mentioned, every type of transportation you could pull behind a horse. Why would you buy a Studebaker wagon above any other wagon? Well, the Studebaker brothers put a bit of engineering into their products. They patented this unique kind of spoke, the slope shoulder spoke, and in particular, it's on the left where the spoke goes into the hub. They radius the corners, and they machined, or well, not machined, but fashioned the wood to match that radius, which created a much stronger spoke. You didn't have the stress riser you would have in a sharp corner, and as a result, the Studebaker wheels were the best on the market. And as you see, they wasted no amount of ink proclaiming that virtue. The Studebaker hubs, as they say, the foundation of a wagon is its wheels, and the heart of a wheel is the hub. And these were all little flyers to convince people, imagine ourselves in the 1870s, 1880s. Why should you pay a little more for a Studebaker? That's why. I've watched a whole lot of episodes of Bonanza and Little House on the Prairie. I never saw a spare wheel being carried on any of those carriages. If you broke a wheel, you were in for a very bad day until you could find a wheelwright or the blacksmith in town. And the Studebakers are here to tell you their wheels were not going to break. Tires did not require setting in 30 years on a Studebaker. Again, not a broken wheel or axle. In use 37 years and still good for haying. Studebaker was offering you the best vehicle on the market, again, according to Studebaker, but what else were they going to say? But there was also a Studebaker dealer and outlet at just about every major city throughout the United States. See, the Studebaker factory, this is actually the same plot of land we saw earlier in the artist's rendering. This is in downtown South Bend. Actually, our minor league ballpark stadium is just off to the picture to the right here. And imagine Studebaker in the late 1880s having the reach of, we'll use a local, the Studebaker name for horse-drawn equipment was like Coca-Cola is for carbonated beverages. It was a universal name. They had outlets all over the country. Studebaker had far greater reach in its horse-drawn age than it ever did as an automobile manufacturer, and it was the universal name. In fact, there was, someone just published this on the social media recently, an episode of Gunsmoke where Miss Kitty is riding into town on a wagon, and care to guess what brand it was? Studebaker. So we see here the Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company. See the masthead with the Studebakers, Clem, J.M., and Peter, and George Studebaker, Clem's son. Now the second generation of the family is getting into the affair here. And we see their repositories, these major warehouses, Chicago, New York, Kansas City, St. Joseph, Missouri, Salt Lake City, San Francisco, Portland, Oregon. And the list would expand as they went on. They added one in Dallas. Atlanta had one. I think they had one in Charlotte, North Carolina for a while. Eventually they moved to St. Louis, Missouri. But it's just the Studebaker brand was ubiquitous in an age when most wagon shops were local or regional affairs. Studebaker was a national and even a global concern. They were exporting wagons as early as 1881. We have a little press clipping that says Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company has just sent a shipload of wagons off to Africa. And they were also selling overseas to all the British Empire's possessions as well. So Studebaker, as we mentioned, copped the slogan from the British Empire, "The sun always shines on the Studebaker." More than 1 million Studebaker vehicles in daily use the world over. And before I move on to the automobile phase here, we have to keep in mind there were years Studebaker was putting out 60, 70, 80,000 vehicles annually. This is, again, pre-assembly line, and they had 400 different styles of transportation you could buy. But just the sheer volume, the sheer numbers that they put on, I think we figured out 1889, I think it was, right around there. They actually produced more wagons that year than they did cars in 1933, 1958, 1965, many years. It was really, I can't understate how vast the Studebaker empire was during the horse-drawn days. But what happens around the turn of the last century? You start hearing this newfangled technology called the automobile. And Studebaker actually started playing around, experimenting with automobiles back in the late 19th century. Around 1897, the board meeting minutes make mention of, looking at automobiles. Nothing really concrete came out of that, but it's recorded that they were looking at that. And generally, it was the second generation that was interested in pursuing automobiles. The old guard, not so much. Clem Studebaker did not want to go near automobiles. John M. Studebaker, his younger brother, was a little more open to that, but Clem, when you're one of the company's founders who opened that blacksmith shop back in 1852, your voice tends to carry a lot of weight in the boardroom. And I wonder what was the coincidence that J.M. Studebaker passed away in 1901. Very next year, in 1902, Studebaker introduces their first automobile. But it was not a gasoline-powered car, it was an electric. Studebaker's electrics, as I mentioned, 1902. Gasoline-powered cars would not arrive until 1904. The gentleman on the left, if we studied our American history properly, if you can see the signature behind there, Mr. Thomas Edison was a customer of one of the earliest Studebaker electrics. And I love this letter from actually his son, Charles Edison, dated August 11, 1930. And he talks about, as near as I can remember, it first went into use around 1902, which would have been in the first year of production, and it was abandoned into its fate sometime in 1925. Good service from that Studebaker electric. And indeed, electrics held significant advantages over many early gasoline-powered cars. And let's face it, to start a pre-1910 gas-powered car, you had to make sure you had to find gasoline, which was not available at there were no Quick Trips or Wawas around that we could get our gasoline. You had to track down gasoline. You had to crank start your engine. You had many various controls you had to operate in just the proper fashion so the thing would stay running. Brakes were questionable, to say the least, but an electric, you hopped in, you flipped a switch, off you went. That's pretty much all there is to it. We have a Studebaker electric, actually very similar to that we had not operated in many years, and it was literally as simple as we got 4 Group 24 12-volt batteries, we hooked them up, you flipped the switch, you selected your speed, and off you went. It was amazing. We were shocked at how simple it was. But gasoline-powered cars were definitely worth looking at. And from 1902 to 1911, you can imagine walking into your Studebaker dealer. You had your choice of horse-drawn equipment, or you could look at a gasoline-powered car, or you could look at an electric automobile. And Studebaker's entry into the gasoline-powered car market was really a stroke of brilliance, I thought. They had the venerated name. They'd been around for well over 50 years. The Studebaker name held a large amount of respect in the transportation field. What Studebaker did is essentially marketed cars produced by other smaller upstart companies. Studebaker had the dealer network. Any number of companies may have been producing a fine automobile, but if you have no distribution and sales network, you're not going to go very far, and that's what the Studebakers had to offer. Studebaker entered into a partnership first with the General Company of Elyria, Ohio, later the Garford Company, also from Ohio. And later, they entered into a substantial partnership with the Everett Metzger Flanders Company of Detroit, Michigan. And that was the company that would propel Studebaker into the automotive age. But pretty typical of gasoline-powered cars in the early 20th century. These had early ones were 2-cylinder. You had the later 4-cylinder models. You see the model 9503. But again, this was a very minor part of Studebaker's market. The horse-drawn business was still going strong in the early 20th century. In fact, even up into the teens, Studebaker was continuing to sell horse-drawn vehicles until 1920. See, an early customer of Studebaker's. Can anyone identify the large man sitting in the back seat? Yes, President Taft. Do we have a prize? I'm sorry, there's no prize. We were hoping, but President Taft, 1908 Studebaker, ferried him around. I love you can actually see the little Studebaker nameplate underneath the front seat there. We mentioned the EMF company. Everett, Metzger, and Flanders, 3 Detroit businessmen. Walter Flanders had early associations with Henry Ford, but wanted to strike out on his own and create his automobile with his partners, William Metzger and Barney Everett. They created the EMF company, and what amounted to a partnership eventually evolved into a takeover. Studebaker acquired EMF in its entirety, and with it came their plants in Detroit, Michigan, and Studebaker was now in the automotive market. However, to acquire the EMF company, Studebaker had to get some financing. Even though the Studebaker family was quite wealthy, they did not have the wherewithal to actually just write a check for EMF. They needed to go outside, and the outside money concerns, Lehman Brothers, I think Goldman, was also approached to help finance the sale. And you saw a significant shift in Studebaker's corporate business at this time. No longer was it the Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company, it was now the Studebaker Corporation. The Studebaker family took a much smaller role in the company's affairs, and for the first time you saw an outsider come in who would eventually run the company, and that was Mr. Albert Erskine. Mr. Erskine was a native of Huntsville, Alabama. He had come to Studebaker from Underwood Typewriter, started in the accounting department, and eventually worked his way up to being the company president. Everyone else who ran Studebaker was either a Studebaker by name or a Studebaker by marriage, and you saw a big shift and really a change in the way that Studebaker was doing business. They went from essentially being a family-run, very substantial horse-drawn manufacturer to they were a modern automotive manufacturer at the end of Mr. Erskine's tenure with the company, and a very different way of going about and doing business. So we see Studebaker is starting to see the horse-drawn business tail back some in the early teens. We see Mr. J.M. Studebaker, the last of the Studebaker original brothers to be running the family in the front passenger seat. We see Mr. Erskine in the back seat in the driver's side. Fred Fish, J.M. Studebaker's son-in-law, who was also active in company affairs, is right behind Mr. Studebaker, and I believe that is James Heaslett, who was in charge of production for the company. And this is taken just outside the company's administration building in South Bend. So what kind of car were you getting if you bought a Studebaker at this time? Well, Studebaker, they had prided themselves on always producing quality product. Like many, they knew it would be folly to compete with Henry Ford in the low-price field, and Studebaker was trying very hard to parlay their horse-drawn reputation into the automobile age. So you got a nice ruggedly engineered product, the Studebaker Big Six. This is from 1919. This was not a company test vehicle. This is actually a privately owned automobile purchased new in Los Angeles by a gentleman who delivered newspapers to various outlets around the Los Angeles area. He'd put 90-some thousand miles on it in his first year. After 4 years, he had 390,000 miles on the car. Studebaker reacquired it from him. Can you only imagine that reading that telegram or that letter? Dear Mr. Jones, we'd like to repurchase your Studebaker that you've driven the wheels off for the last 4 years. And I can only imagine he jumped at that offer. And Studebaker used it for company promotions, and they drove it around the country for another 80-some thousand miles, and that car rests in the galleries of the Studebaker National Museum to this very day. Even though Studebaker had relatively new plants in Detroit, these were rapidly becoming insufficient, and Studebaker was looking at what to do to really take the next step in automobile production. Well, that next step was building brand new plants in South Bend, Indiana. While there were some arguments for staying in Detroit, there was a couple of things. Detroit was running out of land to build new factories at the time, and the people who owned the vacant land knew that, and prices were very expensive. Labor was in constant flux in Detroit as well. In the market, we have minutes from the production department saying how hard it was to maintain a steady pace with the labor turnover they were experiencing. They had a pretty stable workforce in South Bend. They'd been building the horse-drawn vehicles obviously there since the 1850s. They had a lot of virgin land because as they were tapering out of the horse-drawn business, they no longer needed vast sheds of lumber. So the new Studebaker plant was built on the former site of the lumber yards as Studebaker began its transition to its next era of automobile manufacturing. A brand new body plant was erected in the early 1920s, and this building is actually still there. It's part of South Bend's Renaissance Center, and actually doesn't look too terribly different right now, and they're in the midst of renovating that building. And the whole plant was retooled for automobile production. From about 1918 to 1930, Studebaker built the new body assembly plant, a brand new foundry, a new stamping plant, new final assembly buildings. It was a tremendous amount of activity on the Studebaker plant from 1920 until 1930. And Studebaker decided to introduce a new model, Only twice in Studebaker's history did they introduce an all-new car, as in a car that did not share any parts with any previous models. And the first was the Light 6. As you may have guessed, this was a 6-cylinder car and lighter than their other models, the Special 6, which was previously called the Light 6, but it gets confusing. We won't wade hip deep into that today. But the Light 6, the Special 6, and the Big 6. The marketing guys had to get on their feet a little more here. We'll touch on that in a minute. This was the first automobile built entirely in South Bend by Studebaker. They're very proud of that. They even had a celebration to celebrate the opening of the new plant in South Bend. Business dress was required, but you would report to the employee dining rooms at Plant 2 in South Bend, Indiana. As we see the now Studebaker plant, this is an aerial shot from 1926. The factory we saw at the outset, the horse-drawn factory that had the fire, that's way on the left. That 6-story building, that's where that factory stood. Everything you see going to the right, the 4 smokestacks is a power plant. The low building across the street there, that's the Studebaker machine shop where all the castings from the foundry, which is the angled wall building with a sawtooth roof there, and then final assembly just on the other side of that. Studebaker was ready to go, great guns, and they were heading into the automotive business with guns ablazing. So we mentioned, Studebaker is also offering the Light 6, we see the Special 6, and the Big 6, but Studebaker was also experiencing a fundamental problem at this time in its history. Of all the major automobile manufacturers, Studebaker had the narrowest price range in the market, that is, from their most expensive to the least expensive car. Studebaker had the narrowest margin there, and they knew they needed to expand their markets. They needed to broaden their offerings, and Mr. Erskine was on top of that, and he had a plan. We look at Studebaker showroom. This picture is actually of then it was the Sherman Schaus Studebaker dealership in South Bend, Indiana. I'm sorry, it was just a company outlet, later the Sherman Schaus. This building was our previous home of the Studebaker National Museum before we moved into our new facility in 2005. Again, pretty typical of the Studebaker showrooms back in the day. Again, salesmen were standing by ready to put you into a brand new Big 6 touring car or perhaps a Big 6 coupe. In the late 20s, Mr. Erskine started putting the plan into effect. One, we had to rebrand a few things here. The Big 6, although very descriptive, not very imaginative. Well, the Big 6 model in the 7-passenger configuration would now be known as the President. And in fact, if you wander through the exhibit, the wonderful exhibit the folks at Savoy put together here, there is a first-year President, 27 President limousine in the next room. Some of the other Big 6 models became known as the Commander. The Light 6 and Special 6 models transitioned into some were specified as Commanders. Others were nicknamed, the Dictator. And before you sit there and scratch your head, it seemed like a good idea at the time. You have to bear in mind in the 1920s, Dictator had a very different meaning than it would in the later part of the 1930s. Thankfully, Studebaker did retire that name at the end of 1937. Studebaker began more extensive marketing of their vehicles. This particular 27 Commander, as I say, I think you guys have the Cannonball Run cars coming up here. This you could call a very early version of the Cannonball Run car. This car, driven by Ab Jenkins, a noted endurance driver, went from New York City to San Francisco, basically going across the Lincoln Highway, and set a new record for 77 hours and 40 minutes, 3,302 miles. Mr. Jenkins prided himself on being able to drive very long periods without stopping. He drove the entire 77 hours and 40 minutes without stopping, and very minor breaks just to refuel. I can only imagine he downed a lot of coffee along the way. That car was also retained by Studebaker as the company really began extensively marketing, again, more endurance, the performance of Studebaker automobiles. You were getting more in a Studebaker from just a solidly built car. You were getting a car that has something under the hood as well. And we see that car here. And this is one of our favorites on the in the museum because it tells everything you need to know right on the side of the car. No having to remember facts or screwing something up. As we see, he left August 30th at 8 p.m., arrived San Francisco September 2nd at just after 10:40 p.m., 77 hours, 40 minutes to cover 3,002 miles, or 3,302 miles. To conquer the lower end of the market, Mr. Erskine introduced a new small car, modestly named for himself, the Erskine, and it was intended to really be Studebaker's entry-level model. It was designed by Ray Dietrich, a name that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar from the classic era, building Dietrich body cars for many grand marques, Packard, Marmon, Lincoln, Cadillac. The Dietrich body was always a mark of class, and Studebaker wasted very little time and money in promoting the new Erskine. It was thought to be the smartly priced car. It was designed also to kind of be a global car because it was designed to avoid imposing the punitive taxes you had in some European markets. Unfortunately, the Erskine had the deadly defect of being both overpriced and underpowered. It was introduced at a time before the Model A and Walter Chrysler's new Plymouth came out. Those two cars came out and performed and were just as powerful and actually just as good looking as the Erskine, but they did it at half the price and were much better put together automobiles. So we have to, for grading here, the Erskine was not a passing grade for Studebaker in the low price field. But they continued to tout the performance of the Commanders. We see two Studebaker Commanders here on the Auotmobile Speedway in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And Studebaker was actively promoting, again, the endurance of these cars. We have a Studebaker Commander in the collection. It ran 25,000 miles in less than 23,000 minutes. Again, Mr. Jenkins, I believe, was on hand for that one. But for going around the Auotmobile Speedway, I realized 23,000 minutes is kind of difficult to wrap your head around. So we're gonna do some math. Ask the studio audience here. Can anyone tell me how long 23,000 minutes is in day? How many days is that? Anyone? Mental math? The fourth graders are able to do this pretty well, so we got to up our game here. Darn it. That comes out to about 16 and a half days straight that car lapped the track, and it was running time. The clock started, went across the start-finish line, and it didn't stop till it completed 25,000 miles. It was, 16 days straight, day and night. The track was in terrible condition. They had to dodge holes in the board track. So the new world's record, 16 and a half days at 65 miles an hour for a 1928 Studebaker Commander. Studebaker decided to head up to the luxury market, and they acquired Pierce Arrow in 1928. And Pierce Arrow, once one of the three Ps, Packard, Peerless, and Pierce of the luxury market, they had fallen on some hard times in the later 20s, but Studebaker came in, was able to inject some cash and really reinvigorate the company. So you see what Albert Erskine was doing. You had supposedly the Erskine on the low end of the market, Pierce Arrow on the luxury market. He saw what General Motors was doing, and he wanted a piece of that pie. The president got a brand new 8-cylinder engine in 1928, and this was Studebaker's flagship model. Whenever you saw Studebaker president, you could always count on that was the top end of the market for the Studebaker line. So they sent the presidents out to Auotmobile Speedway to see if they could break the Commander's record, and they did. 30,000 miles in I think it was 26,696 minutes, which is, what do we figure? That's about 19 days, I think, at 68 miles an hour. So if you have a 28 president, you want to give it its exercise, just go out and try and top that. Let me know how it turns out. Studebaker started engaging in much broader and bigger and grander promotions. They built a 40-foot-long replica of a 1931 Studebaker President four-season Roadster at the company proving grounds. That is Indiana State Route 2 you see behind there. So everyone driving into South Bend would drive past the proving grounds, see this massive automobile. A grand promotion. The car only survived until 1936, being constructed entirely of wood, and we get winters up in South Bend. It was disposed of in the spring of 1936, but two of the hubcaps did survive, and we have both of those hubcaps in our collection. If you wanted the scope of that, it's probably about the size of the bistro table here right in front of me, if not slightly larger. So you see here, just for scale, that is an actual 31 President four-season Roadster, and you see the huge oversized Roadster sitting in the background. Studebaker was going racing. In Indianapolis, 1930, there was a rule change that permitted stock-blocked entries to compete at the Indianapolis 500, and a couple guys looked at Studebaker's brand spanking new President inline 8 engine and say, this would be a great car to go racing in. And that's what they did. J.C. McDonald Russell Snowberger, the Romthe Special, which was a group of Studebaker engineers who got together on the sly and in a one-car garage, built their own home-built racer. Russell Snowberger also went the Studebaker engine route with the Russell 8, and they did very well. They finished in the money. They kept going. I think the Romthe had a ruptured fuel tank, but the engine was still going strong. And people caught on. So 1931, Snowberger's back, the Richard Special, which is last year's Romthe Special, and then the Hunt Special on the bottom here. This was an off-books, kind of like a skunkworks project the Studebaker's engineering department put together. And they said, hey, let's see how this does. Well, that year, Russell Snowberger actually captured pole position in the Studebaker engine home-built special, and the other cars also finished in the, I think Luther Johnson, I think he was in the top 10, and the Hunt Special also, I think that was 17th or 18th. But they were onto something there. So Studebaker commissioned its own Indianapolis 500 racing team. This is the Studebaker engineering department. You see assembling the cars. Studebaker contracted Herman Rigling, a race builder from Indianapolis, for chassis and body. And then they just rated the Studebaker parts bins for everything else. The front axle and brakes came off the Studebaker 6. Engine came from the Studebaker President. Rear axles were out of, I think it was a 29 Commander. I think the carburetors were actually off of a Studebaker commercial vehicle. And Studebaker went racing. We see here the quintet of Studebaker specials. And this was one of the largest factory-backed entries of all time in Indianapolis. And Studebaker, you have the Miller Fords, which Henry Ford was kind of, they kind of were Fords, but, it wasn't like Ford was out there slapping their name all over everywhere, but there was no mistaking that these were from the Studebaker Corporation, the Studebaker Special. It says there, right on the side of the car. And the Studebakers did very well. The Studebaker President 8 was not the most powerful engine. It wasn't, an exotic, they had Duesenberg engine specials out there, but it was a great trundler. It would keep going and going and going. And the Studebaker engines were good. In order to finish first, you must first finish. And finish indeed they did. Let's see here. The number 22 car, I believe that finished third in 1932. And the other cars all finished in the money. For 1933, 4 of the 5 cars got brand new streamlined bodies. And they went back to the racetrack also with new, more powerful engines and some other chassis modifications. And the number 34 car, that finished the team bet 7th. And between Studebakers and the privateers, they said 7 of the first 12 finishers were all powered by Studebaker. The number 34 car is still with us today. That was just recently acquired by the Studebaker National Museum in the fall of, I believe it was 2023, and we're delighted to have that back in the fold. It was owned by a gentleman in Colorado. I could talk for hours and hours on the Studebaker specials and the Indianapolis program, but we'll have to save that for another time. Unfortunately, in the midst of the Great Depression, Studebaker was feeling the pinch. They tried another new low-price car, and that was the Rockne. This was produced by a separate company, Rockne Motors, but it was all a subsidiary of the Studebaker Corporation. Now, if you're not familiar with college football, you might be wondering about the name Rockne. Well, it was named for Notre Dame football coach Knute Rockne, who was also working for Studebaker as a part-time sales employee. He was like the standard bearer. He was going out. He would represent Studebaker at corporate functions, and he was known for giving these rousing speeches to the dealer associations, and any dealer meeting, they would always have Rockne on at the end, so all the dealers would have to stay till the end of the meeting. And even industry functions. Rockne was a featured speaker at one, and he went out there and gave his, the best speech, and he was worried ahead of time. He's like, these are people who have built cars their entire life. I'm a football coach. And they said, well, Rock, just go out there and do what you do best. Go out there and motivate your team. And when he was done, he had Mr. Sloan, Mr. Chrysler, and Mr. Ford all on their feet cheering after Rockne's spirited comments to the industry members. So here we see Studebaker in 1932. Rockne Motors, Pierce Arrow Motor Car Company, Pierce Arrow of Canada, their commercial division, Studebaker Pierce Arrow Trucks, and their other corporate entities. Unfortunately, things were going poorly at Studebaker, and in March of 1933, the company entered receivership. They were broke, plain and simple. Albert Erskine had refused to really acknowledge the depths of the Depression. He thought that prosperity was just around the corner. That's what everyone was saying that. Certainly Herbert Hoover was trying to sell that claim as well. But Studebaker had a $6,229 claim from Edwards Iron Works, and Studebaker didn't have the cash. And they entered receivership, and the company's fate was very much in the balance. Yet Studebaker emerged. Two Studebaker vice presidents, Paul Hoffman and Harold Vance, were able to convince the bankruptcy court judge that the best way for Studebaker to satisfy its creditors was to continue production. They reorganized. They sold Pierce Arrow for $700,000 in cash. They scaled down their model lineup dramatically. The racing program went away, unfortunately. And Studebaker was able to come back. They emerged within a few months. They were showing I think it was like a $10,000 profit or something like that, but it was a profit. And Studebaker was back on its feet. And by April of 1935, Studebaker was officially out of receivership and ready to head on. And again, the next version of the Studebaker Corporation was coming to life. Auto industry in the 1930s is fascinating. You saw cars go from the very boxy shapes we see with the 27 President into, by the end of the decade, you're seeing very streamlined shapes. The whole field of industrial design was coming into its own at this time. And GM's art and color section came online in the late 20s, and Chrysler had a similar design department. What had once been the purview of the body engineers was now outside consultants, deciding how these vehicles would look. And Studebaker, for their part, hired Raymond Loewy in 1936 to handle their styling. Loewy was a Frenchman, a World War I French Army officer who came to the United States and really was one of the pioneers in the field of industrial design. He did illustrations for Collier's magazine, did a lot of fashion work. He's a very talented interior decorator, but most importantly, Raymond Loewy understood how to make things look better and how things that look better will sell better, and he was able to sell companies on the fact that you build my products and your sales will improve. He was very gifted at that part, a feature that many designers have to learn how to do the hard way. Studebaker's first Loewy design models were the 1938 models. See a 38 Commander convertible sedan here, a recent addition to the Studebaker National Museum's collection. But it was the 1939 Champion, the second all-new car Studebaker introduced in its lifetime, that really cemented Studebaker in the low-price field where the Erskine and the Rockney had failed. The Champion was a rousing success. It cemented Raymond Loewy as a celebrity designer, and you started to see from 1939 on, you see Raymond Loewy's name appearing in many Studebaker advertisements as Studebaker wanted people to know that they had this genius designer bringing out the next Studebaker products. Things were going very well for Studebaker. We see 1940, 1941, the Champion sales were going through the roof. They sold about 38,000 Champions in 1939 in just 4 months. In 1940, that figure nearly doubled. In 1941, they were almost pushing 100,000 Champions, and was also helping the other lines as well. We see in 1941, President Skyway cruising sedan, and yes, Bruce, I had to work my car into the presentation somewhere. This is from our museum calendar photo shoot a couple years ago. But war clouds were looming on the horizon, and Studebaker, as did every other company, when the government came calling, World War II, Studebaker stepped up to the task. And Studebaker's military history actually goes back, many people think the Civil War, even before the Civil War. Studebaker's first government contract for military products was the 1857 Mormon War. And I'm getting a lot of blank stares on there. Google it when you get home, it's a thing. But the U.S. government was getting a little jumpy about what was happening in Utah with Brigham Young and his group heading that way, so they dispatched the U.S. Army to go check things out. Well, they needed some vehicles. They contracted with the Milburn Company of Mishawaka, Indiana, and Milburn couldn't fill the entire order, so they subletted it to the Studebakers as well. I think it was 85 wagons the Studebakers were able to build for that order, but they record that as their first military contract. Studebaker supplied vehicles for the United States Civil War, and if you look column number 125, you'll see an entry for $6,500. That's 50 wagons at $130 each, and you see the customer, U.S., Washington, D.C. That was Studebaker's big contract for the United States Civil War. Studebaker continued to supply vehicles. We see here the Spanish-American War. Studebaker also supplied other allied nations. The Boer War in South Africa, British government contracted Studebaker for wagons and harnesses. World War I, Studebaker was producing army ambulances, transport wagons, sprinkler wagons, water wagons, even for the specialized wagons for different U.S. armies. Turkish government ordered a supply of wagons uniquely outfitted to the needs of terrain where the Turkish army was going to be operated. But in World War II, which was a mechanized war, Studebaker was building motorized projects, and in part, one of the uniquely Studebaker vehicles was the Weasel, a tracked vehicle that could go places where the Jeep could not, and it saw action all over both European and Pacific theaters of war. And we see, can anyone care to guess whose Weasel this is here? I think we see him, Douglas MacArthur, yes. We see the Weasel somewhere in France, South Pacific, Pacific Beach, Bougainville, and they even made an amphibious version of the Weasel, which was very helpful for if you come up to a body of water, your Weasel can go right across. You don't need to wait for the engineers and the bridging equipment. You can continue on your way. And the Weasels actually continue to see action in Korea as well. One of our board members who passed away several years ago was in Korea, and he says, oh yeah, we used the Weasels, and he said, what he experienced was, and I think in World War II, if there was an amphibious landing, the Weasels could go in and snatch up the wounded soldiers in places with the tracks. He says that was really one of their best uses, he felt, in the course of the war. Studebaker also built airplane engines, the Wright Cyclone radials for the B-17 bomber, in addition to 168,000 U.S. Army trucks, which saw duty. Many of them were shipped to Russia, to the point where we just had some Russian visitors about 10 years ago. The word Studebaker in Russian is like a slang term for truck. And I'd heard this off and on over the years, and we had some visitors, and I can't remember exactly where they're from, and it's like, okay, we've heard this. He said, oh yeah, it's like, in other parts, I understand Coke is kind of a term for all carbonated beverages in parts of the country. It's the same. Studebaker means truck in Russia as a shorthand. But after World War II, there's tremendous pent-up demand, no new cars for 4 years. Studebaker went back to Raymond Loewy, and they said, we want something new. Studebaker introduced an all-new styling after World War II, the only company to do so. And we see the wonderful Starlight Coupe. I think you got the 48 Commander in the next door, that wonderful turret back window, and really a Studebaker icon. And Studebaker proclaimed themselves first by far with a post-war car, and there was no mistaking the Studebaker for anything else. Everyone else just dusted off what they were building in 1942, but out came the new Studebaker. It was half a foot lower. It looked modern. It looked stylish. And Studebaker was going great guns, and this was really the best days and the most successful time of Studebaker's automotive history. Fast forward to 1950, the bullet nose models. This is the Studebaker icon. Studebaker put a propeller on the front of the car. Raymond Loewy's instruction was the car should look like an airplane. And the designer said, okay. And out came the bullet nose models. Now, we hear about, the joke was in the Studebaker world, it seemed like everyone knew someone who had a bullet nose Studebaker. You'd hear that at the club meets, you'd have one out, it's like, oh, my nephew's band teacher has one of those, the postman has one of those. Everyone knew something was Studebaker because there was no mistaking for anything else. But when they first introduced the design, they weren't selling that well. People were a little taken aback by the boldness. We have pictures, I think it's Hodak Motors in Kankakee, Illinois, where there's a picture of their showroom window, and there's a bullet nose Studebaker in the front, and there's potted palms strategically placed in front of the bullet noses. It's like they were trying to kind of sneak people into not being shocked by how bold the new Studebaker was. But they caught on. By the end of 1950 and 1951, Studebaker's best year was 1950. They sold close to 400,000 cars and trucks. They sold another 250,000 in 1951. And all told, close to, I think, what did we tally, about almost 500,000 bullet nose models were produced in those 2 years. And they weren't just styles. Studebaker introduced a brand new automatic transmission in 1950, the first fully automatic transmission in the low price field. In 1951, a brand new V8 engine. Now, this is when Ford would be hanging on to the flathead for another 3 or 4 years, and other companies. You had Cadillac and Olds with their V8s in 1949, but really, Studebaker in the low-price field, you had a lot of reasons to go down and buy a Studebaker. You were getting course, fresh, though controversial, Raymond Loewy styling, but you were certainly going to stand out from the neighbors. You get a brand new V8 engine, a brand new automatic transmission. There was a lot to like at your Studebaker dealer. Studebaker celebrated their centennial in 1952 with a grand celebration. They paced the Indianapolis 500 that year. The whole year was just a celebration of Studebaker's 100 years in vehicle manufacturing. And on the heels of the 1952 centennial was Studebaker's finest design, may consider this one of the most beautiful cars at that time, the 1953 Starliner, again from the drawing boards at the Raymond Loewy Studios. This was, to look at early 1950s American automotive design, this was kind of a lot of perpendicular, kind of square, kind of boxy. Loewy and his team come out with the car that's streamlined, very European, again, lower than anything else on the market. People were still, what is this? It just was in such stark contrast if you look at a 53 Ford, and no disrespect to anyone here who's a 53 Ford fan, I understand they're fine automobiles, but this was just a jaw dropper, and today remains one of the most popular and the most recognized Studebakers of all time. If only they had sold and Studebaker could have built them. The company was really in turmoil in the early 50s. Despite the success after World War II, once the seller's market disappeared, about 1952, 1953, suddenly in 1954, Henry Ford got sick of coming in second to Chevrolet in the sales war and said, we're going to outsell Chevy, and cut their prices and flooded their cars with dealers. Chevy said, okay, we can do that too, and they did. And what happened was the independents and everyone else who wasn't Ford or Chevrolet or GM was left holding the bag. Suddenly Studebaker, which had produced just passenger cars, 343,000 cars in 1950, was producing 80,000 cars in 1954. And other independents were feeling the pinch. Even Chrysler volume was off 25% in 1954 because of the sales war. And Studebaker was running out of money, and they had to do something fast. And that came in the form of a merger with the Packard Motor Car Company. It was no longer Studebaker, it was Studebaker-Packard. They had a grand celebration at Notre Dame Stadium. Bob Hope was on hand to tell people that Studebakers were here to stay. And he had other, Les Brown and his band of renown, Jerry Colonna, if anyone remembers that name. I had to look him up, but he was a big star of the day. He was on hand as well. But unfortunately, the merger, which was termed two drunks helping each other across the road, proved to be far more accurate than anyone cared to admit. Studebaker was cash poor. Packard had some money, but they were also having some pretty severe product issues at that time. And ultimately, it bought some time for Studebaker. Packard only lasted till 1958. The only tangible product that reflects the marriage of these two models is the 1956 Golden Hawk. It had the Studebaker, the new for 1956 Hawk line, but with the Packard V8 engine. Aside from that, there was never really product interchange between the companies. And by 1958, a recession year, Studebaker's volume, and I mentioned one of those years where Studebaker built less automobiles than they did horse-drawn vehicles, a century prior. Well, that was 1958, and Studebaker was on the ropes again. Studebaker's new president, Harold Churchill, had an idea for a compact car, the Lark. And very similar to the theme of the Champion, he looked at what was selling. He looked at Rambler, was the only American Motors and their products was the only company to really increase production in 1958, and he saw a market that was untapped, and with a whirlwind precision, Studebaker created the Lark. Boom, Studebaker sold 127,000 cars in 1959, and it set a record for profits at $27 million. The Scotsman of 1958 had pointed the way the year before, a stripped-down version of the 58 Champion, and that really gave Churchill the go-ahead. He's like, okay, this car is selling, nothing else is selling. Let's go for both feet into the compact market. Unfortunately, in 1960, the Ford Falcon, Chevy Corvair, Plymouth Valiant came out, all compacts. Suddenly, Studebaker was going head-to-head, and Rambler didn't miss a beat. They continued just selling compact cars hand over fist as well. And Studebaker was once again in the position of having to compete with the big three. They didn't have the volume to do that. And their dealer network was also facing a toll. In 1959, you had a lot of dual dealers who, you might have been a Buick dealer, you picked up the Studebaker franchise so you could sell a Lark. Well, now you could look at any number of other options. And like, I think it was certain Plymouth dealers, once the Valiant came out, They handed back their Studebaker franchise so they could sell Valiants instead of Larks, and Studebaker was once again feeling the pinch. A new president came on board at Studebaker in 1961. That was Sherwood Egbert. He was a 42-year-old ex-Marine who was formerly of McCulloch Corporation, and he was as different of a leader to what Studebaker had previously, like what Albert Russell Erskine was in the teens. Completely outside the company, came in with no preconceived notions. There was a lot of Studebakers kind of, we've always done it this way. There was a lot of institutional inertia with how things were run at Studebaker. And he just upset the apple cart left and right. He would walk through the factory at all hours. He would go down the line and introduce himself to people. He would poke in piles of garbage. What's this doing here? Let's get this cleaned up. Completely new way of doing business. And they said Harold Churchill, most everyone would refer to him as Church. It was Mr. Egbert, and you should remember that. In the administration building, at the end of the day, your desk had to be completely clear, just your blotter left on top of the desk, and the phone was to be put in the upper left-hand desk drawer. Nothing was to be left out for the next day of business. There was a new sheriff in town. He immediately instigated a product update. Studebaker, he's a couple things. He's like, one thing, our advertising campaign stinks. We need to update the product. We need to buy time until we can really right the ship. The Gran Turismo Hawk was restyled from the 1961 Hawk, which really hadn't changed much since 1957. Now, for a personal luxury, it tended to be kind of a personal sporty car. The Thunderbird had already been redesigned twice, and the Hawk hadn't been changed at all. They were just kind of building them because they could, and the tooling was already paid for. Egbert brought in Brooks Stevens to give the Hawk a new kind of Thunderbird-styled look, and it worked. I mean, the Hawk sales, the Gran Turismo Hawk, tripled the previous year's sales despite costing $350 more than it did the year prior. But his really big project was the Studebaker Avanti. Now, this is one of the most improbable stories in the automotive industry. You had a car that went from drawing board to production in just over 18 months. In the automotive industry, 3 to 5 years is considered the norm, and 3 years is considered rushed. The Ford Mustang, I think, was about three and a half years gestation, and Ford, was all up in arms. It's like, oh my gosh, we can't do this. And how did they do that? Because they basically reskinned a Falcon and did a bunch of other things. Studebaker Raymond Loewy took his team out to the desert in Palm Springs in a bungalow for 6 weeks. They came back out of there with a clay model. Loewy was on there, working hand in hand with the designers full time. This clay model was rushed back to South Bend. Studebaker's production department looked at it, created a full-size clay. From there, they went and tooled up a fiberglass body. They put it over the existing Studebaker Lark chassis, slightly modified, and from a project that started in February of 1961, the first Avantis came out in April of 1962. And again, if someone read a movie about this, no one would believe it because that's next to impossible. And the Avanti story is even more crazy because after Studebaker went out to close the plant and discontinued the Avanti, 2 South Bend businessmen who had never built a car in their life went to the bank and said, hi, we want to build some cars. We'd like to produce the Avanti on our own. And I don't know how many martinis were served at this lunch, but I have to think it was several. Because you're the loan officer. Okay, have you guys ever built a car before? No. What car are you looking at building? Studebaker's Avanti. How did that sell? Not well. And how do you plan to do this? Well, we're going to buy an old Studebaker plant and all the parts and some of the workers. We're going to put some cars together. Okay, sounds good to me. Here you go. There's your check. And thank you to everyone here at Savoy for bringing the Avanti out here on the market, or on the turntable here. But just a couple things I want to point out about the Avanti as an automobile. It's amazing the car turned out as good as it did. It's certainly not a perfect automobile by any means, but I mean, what car in the early 60s was? But just for such a rush condition, it's actually a very nice automobile to drive. It's actually one of the few Studebakers my wife has gotten into and driven, and she says, oh, I could drive this. And, I pointed out it didn't have air conditioning, and she didn't seem to mind too much with that either. But let's see which way we go here. We're going to go out to the front view here. One of the design features of the Avanti, there's no grill. Raymond Loewy thought grills dated cars, so that's why you have the bumper, the air intake under the front bumper. The gun sight and the raised portion on the hood here, this is directly in line with the steering column. So when you're sitting behind the car, you're looking straight down the steering column, you're looking right down the gun sight on the bulge, and it helps you kind of make you feel one with the car. It helps orient yourself on the roadway. As they say, you can line up the gun sight with like the horizon, where the road meets the vanishing point, and it's supposed to give you a sense of familiarity and more intimacy with the car. Let's see, we'll go around again here too. Again, they had to adapt this coachwork to the existing Lark chassis. They took the Lark convertible frame, sawed it off at the back. They had to lengthen it at the front, but you still couldn't quite fit the Avanti body on there. We see these little bulges right here, these little kickouts. Well, that's because the Lark frame was too long in the back. So they had to build these little enclosures. And what do you do with that from the backside? Because that's really going to stick out. You can see the spring shackles standing under there. Well, that's why they created these little inverted bumper guards to help hide the fact that there's the frame extension back there. And it looks really nice. I think it comes off pretty well. The taillights, for example. The reason that there's this extra gap between the taillight and the fender and the backup light in the trunk, well, the production guys were worried they couldn't align the trunk so everything would line up, so they just moved them farther apart so no one would notice in case there was a misalignment between the backup light and the taillight. Let's see. Just one last thing, and we'll get on to the rest of the history, which frankly gets a little depressing from here on out, so we'll just focus on the Avanti for just another quick minute here. The fuel filler neck goes through the passenger compartment because the Avanti gas tank is right behind the back seat. Studebaker's chief designer, Randy Farrow, he had this thing about symmetry. He liked symmetry, he did not like asymmetry, and it bothered him that there was a filler neck on one side but nothing on the other. And all the designers had to convince him, it's like, no, this is great. They were pursuing an aircraft theme with how the cockpit was laid out. And they said, oh no, it's very aircraft. We'll just cover it in vinyl and pad it. It'll be much like an aircraft cockpit. And if you haven't had time to look inside the Avanti, ask someone where the headlight switches are. They're above the windshield. Like aircraft, so many switches are all over the place. And that was, Sherwood Egbert was an amateur pilot. He was, he loved that theme of it. The Avanti's front seats are carbon copies, actual piece-by-piece copies from early 60s Alfa Romeo Sprint Speciale. One of the Studebaker designers was trying to come up with a sports car seat, and the Studebaker Hawk seats were way too tall. You would have had to have been 5'3" to fit in the Avanti. So he went home, got the Alfa seat, copied it piece by piece for the Avantis. And if you ever see them side by side, it's uncanny how they did that. We could talk about the Avanti again for much longer here, but we'll get back to the rest of the program. I understand Bruce told me we had to get everyone home in time for Saturday Night Live. Was that it? So we mentioned the Avanti debuted 1962 in April. We see this is from a Chicago dealership. Its public showing was at the 1962 Indianapolis 500. The winner, Roger Ward, got to take home the pace car, the Avanti, as was the custom, although the Avanti was not it was the honorary pace car. Unfortunately, Mr. Ward lived in Texas, where it gets quite warm, and he had gotten the supercharged Avanti to take home. Well, apparently that lasted a couple months, and I think at the tail end of July or August, he wrote Studebaker and said, can you possibly send me a car with air conditioning? Which they were more than happy to do. Well, unfortunately, the Avanti did not, and frankly could not, save Studebaker. At best, Studebaker was hoping to buy time until they could right the ship, get more financing, improvements to the product line, and update things, but it was too late. The company closed the South Bend plant December of 1963. This is actually the final day of production, regular production, December 20th, 1963. And at that time, Studebaker shut down the South Bend plant and continued producing cars at their plant in Hamilton, Ontario, but really Studebaker was playing out the string at this time. They had no grand plans for any models beyond just the immediate things for next year's model, next couple years model years. They were not signing up any new dealers after about, I think it was mid-64 going into 65. The end was near, and the company, the directors of the Canadian plant were essentially told, make the best of it. If you can turn a little profit, that'd be great. But, it kind of the unwritten rule was, just know this is probably not going to be a long-term operation. And indeed, 1966 was the final model year for Studebaker. We see Canadian President Gordon Grundy looking at the new 66 Studebakers ready to go out on the market. A noted celebrity Studebaker owner, actually of a 1966 Studebaker, Frances Bavier, also known as Aunt B from the Andy Griffith Show and Mayberry RFD. If you catch a rerun of Mayberry RFD, you occasionally will see Mrs. Bavier driving her own Studebaker on the show. This is the very last Studebaker ever produced. This was St. Patrick's Day, 1966, at exactly 8:11 in the morning. This car came off the end of the Canadian assembly line, and that ended 114 years of automobile manufacturing under the name of Studebaker. We have this car in the museum's collection. How do we know it was 8:11 in the morning? Well, one of our life trustees was actually Studebaker's PR man at the time. And he knew if he scheduled it for 8:11 in the morning, he told me, he's like, I was pretty sure I could get Channel 11 News to come out and cover it. And he's like, I just remember that to this very day. After Studebaker, again, that's a talk for another time here. We're running a little long here. But the company's vehicle collection, what they had gathered since the late 19th century, was given to the city of South Bend. That collection became the basis for the Studebaker National Museum, as I serve as archivist, where we have a 55,000 square foot facility in South Bend, Indiana's West Washington Historic District. So please, if you're heading up to northern Indiana or heading to the upper Midwest, please come by and see us, check us out, and I'll have our website and everything on the taglines here. Many other museums too. If you're thinking, well, that's a long way to go for but one museum, but no, you can check out the newly renovated Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum, just a couple hours away in Indianapolis, the Auburn Cord-Duesenberg Museum in Auburn, Indiana, about a couple hours away in there. Gilmore Museum up in Kalamazoo, the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. Take a week, come on up, see us all. We'd love to have you come by. So with that, I will gladly field any questions.
Okay, so we have a couple microphones to come around, so if you would wait for us to get you the microphone before you ask the question so we can get it on the recording. Okay, got one here.
Hey, Andy. I am a big Avanti fan. And one thing I noticed about this 63 that I have never seen in another Avanti, and I want to know if it was a factory option or accessory, is if you look at the back of the seats, it's got little hooks for headrests. And I have never seen that before. And I wondered if you had in your experiences.
I want to say there was a headrest option, but I have never seen an Avanti with one. So maybe we're seeing it both for the first time here, Ken. Yeah,
well, I knew they had the headrest options on Larks and everything else, but I have never seen an Avanti other than the later Avanti 2s with the high backs, But
as the young kids say, I was today years old when I just saw that. So thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about which Studebaker models Virgil Exner was responsible for designing?
Oh man, does anyone have dinner reservations? So Virgil Exner is one of the more controversial figures in Studebaker history. He came to Studebaker, I think he might have come on board, I think it was 38. He came over from Pontiac. And he was Loewy's number one at the South Bend office. And you have to understand about Raymond Loewy Associates. Loewy was not a Studebaker employee as such. He contracted his firm's services to Studebaker. And if you want a little bit of levity, look at Loewy's letterhead from the times they had the Studebaker accounts. This is, Raymond Loewy Associates, offices in New York City, Paris, Sao Paulo, Brazil, South Bend, Indiana. It's like one of these things is not like the other. So Loewy was not on site all day, every day at Studebaker. In fact, he was, he would check in every now and again. He would make regular trips to South Bend, don't get me wrong. But he had a day-to-day manager who ran the office, and that was Virgil Exner for a lot of years. Well, Exner bristled at Loewy's policy of taking personal credit for his firm's work. And this came to a head right after World War II. The 47 models have success. Success has many fathers, failure is an orphan, as they say. But the 47 models were largely Exner The pre-war models were like the 41, the 4041s we saw earlier, and even the 39 Champion to a certain degree. Those had extra influence as far as, and again, any of these, you have to understand that Loewy's team had 40 or 50 designers, claim modelers, everyone else working for. As far as under Exner's direction, you could point to a lot of the pre-war models and some of the post-war models. To credit any one design to him as, kind of like later in Chrysler. When Exner was a Chrysler, I didn't exactly hear him point at, many subordinates either for singling them out for credit on designs. But yeah, I'd say that's the best. Probably the late pre-war models were probably the ones that had the most, and the 47, 48, 49s had the strongest Exner influence.
I got one for you.
Yeah.
So how many of the Studebaker electrics do you think are still around?
How many Studebaker electrics are around? Well, we have, in the Studebaker Museum's collection, we have 4. So one in the Swigert Museum, and I know of about 3 or 4 more beyond that that are in private collections, so I'd say maybe a dozen or so. And the math comes out, Studebaker only made 1,811 electric vehicles from 1902 to 1911. So, I mean, you didn't have a wide pool from the get-go, and especially the commercial electric vehicles just saw hard lives, and I'm sure once those wore out and people looked at how much a battery was going to cost to replace it, and was like, hey, now the gasoline cars have self-starters. And, the self-starter was really what killed the electrics. When you could push a button to start the engine instead of cranking it, sign me up for that. So, yeah, I'd say probably about a dozen would be my guess.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask you about, as the plant was the closure, and if you could talk a little bit about as they're finishing cars up and the Avanti too. I've read something, but I was wondering if you could shed some light on that for me.
Did you have something specific regards to that? Or
As far as after production was closing down, did they
Yeah.
continue to assemble cars to use up some of the parts?
Oh,
and
yeah,
some-
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, I misunderstood there. So when they closed down the South Bend plant, and you have to parse this out by, we always say the last day of regular production was December 20th, 1963. We have the last car to come off the assembly line in 1964, Daytona hardtop. In the museum, it has like 23 miles on the odometer. But they continued producing Avantis just to finish out what was on the line, because the Avanti line was completely different than the Hawk and Lark line. So the Avantis were put together in a different building. The last Studebaker Avanti was built December 31st, 1963. So was that the last Studebaker? Well, they had a contract to produce military trucks, which they continued to produce at the Chippewa Avenue plant into 1964, and also produce the postal vehicles, the Zip Van, which they also continued to produce in South Bend in 1964. And a lot of the stuff, just the spare parts went off into Avanti, into the spare parts. Avanti Motors bought a lot of surplus parts to produce the Avantis, and they still had some where their own parts and service division was maintaining a stock, and they even had to commission some new parts production after they discontinued production total in 1966. So some build out, yes, some they kept for existing productions in Canada. A lot went into the surplus, some got dumped. That's when Studebaker went out of production. I've said there are a couple things that really helped get Studebakers in the collector world. One, there was a tremendous supply of spare parts, because Studebaker often in later years were hoping to build many more cars than they actually sold. So it wasn't until, Ken and I can buy brand new front fenders, brand new old stock steel front fenders for our 64 Studebakers for about, most swap meets, $400 for a pair? Yeah, there's still parts to be had out there. So, and also with as bad as the American cars were trying to get used to emissions, and in the early 70s, you had a pretty good, a used Studebaker got pretty good gas mileage for the gas crunch, and also you could fix it pretty easily too. So that's something there too. But yeah, does that shed any light onto your question? Yes, sir.
There was a question the other day. Someone was aware of the fact that there had been follow-on production of various enterprises making the Avanti, And the question was whether they still did that or how many people had done that as like the Avanti 2.
Yeah, the Avanti is the car. Again, it's like a cat. I think we're only up to 5 lives on the Avanti, so we got a few more yet to go there. But the running joke amongst Studebaker people, and we don't want to air all of our dirty laundry, but the running joke is every owner of an Avanti has always heard someone say, "Hey, aren't they still building those in Canada somewhere?" And actually, they never built Avantis in Canada, or at least not yet. So under Leo Newman and Nate Altman, the original Avanti Motors Corporation, they built cars until I think it was 82, 83. Then a gentleman, Steve Blake, owned it. He then sold it to Michael Kelly, who moved it to Youngstown, Ohio. Then J.J. Cafaro bought it, and somewhere in Ohio, and kept it there. And I'm trying to remember if that was contingent on the purchase. Then they later moved on to build them in Villa Rica, Georgia. Then the updated version of the Avanti, which came out as basically a reskinned Camaro Firebird, and later on the Mustang chassis. Some of those were built, Cancun, Mexico comes into the mix, but I think some of those were also in Villa Rica, Georgia, and then Michael Kelly bought them back. But the last Avanti automobile, I think it was 2009, 2010, and that was on the Mustang chassis. And we haven't heard, every now and again you'll hear a little thing, and I think with the advent of AI and the internet, you're probably going to see more fake Avantis showing up in the world just on social media and other outlets. But a tangible Avanti you can drive 2009, 2010 was the last for those.
Okay,
Got one over here.
one more.
I understand that the Avanti was known to be a very powerful car at the time. Can you elaborate on the R1 and the R2 and R3?
I can. So the Avanti was actually advertised as being one of America's fastest production automobiles. Especially prepared Avanti was set a record 168 miles an hour at the Bonneville Salt Flats, which there are obviously tweaks and stuff. We aren't hopping in this car and going 168 miles an hour tonight. Are we, Bruce? No? No, okay.
Tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow. Get early. The roads are much clearer on Sunday mornings. So your stock Avanti was the Avanti R1, this basically a 240 horsepower version of the Studebaker V8, warmed up by Andy Granatelli. They adjusted camshafts and valve timing and compression ratios and things to give that a little more juice. The R2 engine had the supercharger, good for about 289, 290 horsepower. The R3 engine, which is like the holy grail for Studebaker owners, that has completely different cylinder heads, induction system, camshaft. That is the really big grunt. Granatelli dynoed those at 411 horsepower, just a massive increase. And there was also an R4 model with twin 4-barrel carburetors that was mainly to look good at the Bonneville Salt Flats. That engine does not really work well as an everyday passenger car automobile engine, even by high performance standards, but it is out there and they did offer that.
Okay, last question. Here we go.
And I'll gladly stick around if anyone has any more in-depth questions they need to air in person here.
Andy, can you give us a promotional talk on your museum and what we could see when we go there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So you saw my brief commercial at the end here. We say over 116 years of vehicle manufacturing. So we have the oldest Studebaker in existence, the family's Conestoga wagon from 1830. We have the largest collection of presidential carriages in the United States. President Lincoln's carriage he took to Ford's Theater. The Marquis de Lafayette's carriage that he took on his tour of the United States in 1824. McKinley, Harrison, and Grant count our presidential carriage collection. You saw some of the vehicles we highlighted on screen from the record-setting cars, our Indianapolis 500 race car. We're actually doing a special program on that this Friday to celebrate Carburation Day at the Indianapolis 500. Please check us out. I realize the Avanti's in front of our website and everything on there, but just check us out, studebakermuseum.org. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you want to head north in July to escape, let's face it, it gets a little warm about that time down here in Georgia. Our Concord Elegance at Copsha Home will be entering its 8th year. We are featuring Rolls-Royce and Mercury this year, and also have a special class of Ghia-bodied automobiles, American full classics, brass era 1920s cars, and micro cars, because who doesn't like to see a whole bunch of micro cars running around the Concord show field? That's our biggest hit every year. So that's Saturday, July 12th. And many more things. Again, check out the website, follow us on Facebook, and like I mentioned, it's not just one stop. If you're a car junkie, you can blow a whole week in the upper Midwest, and you'll still be wishing you could have stayed longer.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was a great question. Thanks for everything, Andy. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Hopefully we'll see you at the next program, which will be in June for the Barn Find Hunter. Thank you.